Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It's a chilly one here in London, but you may be joining from anywhere in the world in this day and age. This is the final installment for this year's planning school. My name's Daryl Chen, and I'm the trustee of the London Society. And every year we run the planning school, looking at an aspect of planning and urban development that pertains to London's future. And this year we've had the fortune of looking abroad for inspiration and comparison. And many of you will have seen and participated in talks in past weeks with Takeshi Hayatsu on Tokyo, and last week Catherine Firth on Boston. Today we are joined by David Rudlin, who is one of UK's leading urbanists. He's a master planner, and he's currently chair of the Academy of Urbanism and an honorary professor at Manchester University. At the London Society, we won't hold that against you. He was, in 2014, winner of the Wolfson Economics Prize, which is a freaking big deal because, the built environment professionals don't often do that. And it was amazing and wonderful and incredibly thorough, and I think incredibly influential entry. And the Wolfson Economics Prize is one of the most valuable economics prizes in the UK. And so it's been much published, and I encourage you to look that up, looking at a contemporary garden city. He's written 3 books, including the most recent, Climax City, which he'll be speaking on this evening, and I've read myself, and I can thoroughly recommend it. He also writes regularly for The Guardian and has a column in BD magazine, notably one of the few non-architect columnists. I'm going to leave it with that. And I thoroughly experienced urbanist, and really pleased that he said yes to speaking to us today. We're going to speak. David will speak about half an hour. Please start putting through your questions, and we'll pick those up afterwards. But without further ado, hand over to David.
Daryl, thank you. Let me see if I can share my screen, and then I can relax. Because it's always the most difficult bit of these things. I'm hoping you're now seeing a picture of some French buses in a forest. I'm guessing you are, yeah?
Yes, indeed.
Good, okay, thank you. I just want to start with a couple of caveats. I'm not French, as you can probably tell from my accent, although I'm married to a French person. And I'm not sure I would consider myself, no, I definitely wouldn't consider myself an expert in the French planning system. What I did a few years ago when we were working on the book Climax City was to try and understand how the system, there we go, it's not moving on. So this is Climax City, and myself and a colleague friend called Shruti is actually in India, and we were very interested in the process by which cities are built. And it seemed to us that actually the planning system was slightly confused about the way cities work. They were working on the misapprehension that you could plan a city as in you could draw a plan of a city, and somehow the city corresponded to your plan. In 20 years' time, the plan was the thing that you drew, and that almost never works. And as Daryl and I both know, in master planning terms, the plan that you draw is never the one that gets built, certainly not in its entirety. If it does, it's very rare. And that's because we misunderstand the process of how cities grow. We misunderstand how cities develop. And the idea of the book is that cities are essentially the human equivalents of termite mounds or ant colonies, that they are complex emergent systems, and that you take a whole series of societal variables, of planning variables, of economic variables, and the pattern that emerges is the pattern that gets built. And this is Paris, as you probably can tell. And if you look at these drawings, which are slightly obsessive, and the book is full of incredibly obsessive drawings, and they are extraordinary. This is completely different to the development you get in London. The density of plot coverage is extraordinary in Paris, and these series of courtyards that you get into blocks, and it's because of the climax form, and the idea of Climax City is that all cities have a climax form, just as all ecosystems have a climax vegetation state, and that's the key is actually to find out what that climax form is, and so Paris is different. But the thing about the climax form in cities is that they're not. I mean, some of them actually are very purely self-organized. I know the first of the talks you had was about Tokyo, which is about as close as you can get to a purely self-organized city. But most cities are planned, and actually planning sets the parameters for that complexity to merge. And so I became therefore very interested in planning and planning systems and how different planning systems worked. And it seems to me that the French system, which is very different to the British system, it actually works better in that respect, in that it doesn't try and plan everything. It doesn't have discretion very much within it. It has a set of rules, and those rules create parameters, and the city then self-organizes into those rules. And so that's what I'm going to talk about this evening, and I'm going to do it in two parts. The first part, historical, because in the book we talk a lot about the replanning of Paris, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time thinking about the replanning of Paris and how that happened and how it differs from the way that London has historically been replanned. And then secondly, to actually look at the French planning system itself and how that affects day-to-day development, as it were. But as I say, if you're looking for advice on how to get planning permission for your villa in the Dordogne, you probably come to the wrong place. So this is bit of Paris, actually. It's worth just looking at. I think you can see my cursor. This pointy bit at the end here these are the ends of the walls that once ran around Paris, as you'll see in a second. And this pointy building here, and maybe that one there actually, is here, which is one of the drawings from the book. And actually, you can see the road on the left is going upwards, and the boulevard to the right is staying at a level, and that is because that was once the top of the wall around the city. And I love the echoes that you get within cities of these past forms, and you can do that. We can start to look at that. I'm sorry, the date has been knocked off the bottom of that map. It says the year 800. This is Paris in the year 800. Ile de la Cité was the historic core of the city, the defensive settlement on the island. We can then run it forward. And there we go. So it's grown a little bit there. This is the year 1100. Is that moving? There we go. Yeah. So obviously we had a time of peace. The city breaks out from its walls and starts to develop in the surrounding countryside. We then get the year, is that 13? I can't remember the dates of these now. This is probably about 1300. And again, we have a time of conflict again, and so another wall goes up. Paris has had 6 walls in its history. And actually, it's one of the things that's fascinating when you look at European cities, that they all have walls, and they all go through periods of compression and expansion. So they grow within their walls. The walls prevent them from going outwards, and then they burst out of their walls, and they have this expansion period, and then a new wall gets built and they get confined again. London obviously did have walls, but actually most of Britain has been at peace for so long that our cities are not constrained by walls in anything like the same way. So we can move forward again a bit further, and then we got the walls, which would become the boulevards of Paris, being built around it then. This is 1500. Then we get to the early 1600s. This is 1643. And this was the time when people like Indigo Jones, John Evelyn were going over from London to look at what was happening in Paris. And this was a period when Paris was seen to be much more civilized and much more planned than a city than London. And there was a great deal of jealousy of what was happening in Paris and how London should be aspiring to that. And in fact, the Indigo Jones plan for Covent Garden was a sort of direct result of trying to learn from the Parisian experience. I can move forward to the next one. So we're going forward now. This is 17 40s. This is the time when you can see the boulevard, the wall is gone. So the wall around here, if you can see my cursor, has disappeared to be replaced by the grand boulevards. This is, of course, a long time before Haussmann. And you've got the Louvre starting to appear. You've got the axis of the Champs-Élysées starting to appear. The next one is when the Champs-Élysées comes into its own. This is under, obviously, the kings of France with Le Notre master planning the Champs-Élysées and this whole axis through here. And the boulevards around the edge, but the center of Paris was still very much medieval. And by this time, Paris was seen as being very dirty and backward and polluted and dangerous because of the old medieval heart. The boulevards were away from the center, whereas the center was still very dense and cluttered. And this is, we've gone forward now, this is actually just around 1900, but it shows the Paris post Haussmann. So this is the boulevards that Haussmann created from the 1850s right the way through to about the 1920s when Boulevard Haussmann was finished. And you can see Paris pretty much as it is today. I've got a quote here from John Evelyn, and this is really from those trips. John Evelyn was one of the people that did the plans for London after the Great Fire. And traveling to Paris in the 1670s, he wrote that Paris was so comparably fair and uniform that you would almost imagine yourself in an Italian opera, and comparing to London, where the buildings was deformed as the minds and confusions of the people, probably didn't make him massively popular. Very large, ugly town, pestered with hackney coaches, insolent carrymen, shops, taverns, noise, and such clouds of sea coal as if they resemblance to hell on earth. And so this is a history of these the cities, obviously huge competitors with each other, swinging between, at one moment Paris was seen as being the great civilized city, and then at another moment London was seen as being the civilized city and Paris not so much. So there's a really interesting sort of toing and fro and going across there. I thought it's worth sort of comparing that sort of sequence of maps of Paris to another sequence which is in the book of London, and this is London in the pre-fire era, and the red bit of the map is the bit that burns in the Great Fire of London, and this is then, I'm sorry, the text has knocked itself out on the box, so you probably can't quite see that, but this is Wren's plan for London. I'm sure people, as members of the London Society, you're only too aware of these plans. And then this is the John Evelyn plan of London, both of which are, plans of boulevards and circuses and very formal development. And of course, this is what London looked like by 1862, so 1806. And so essentially, the medieval plan of London pre-fire was what got built afterwards, despite all the good intentions of the planners and the government and the king to rebuild something more civilized. It's just the British system didn't allow it to happen. And essentially the reason for that is that the British system is very respectful of land ownership powers. So you can see in the top left of this plan, you can see the master planning that did take place around London, which was obviously on the green fields around the city, Bloomsbury and Mayfair and places like that. So we were able to plan areas which were in single ownership, which were green fields and therefore didn't have existing uses. The British system is completely unable to plan existing cities because we don't traditionally have the powers to interfere with people's ownership rights. And so the first thing we need to do before we even get to the nature of a planning system is to understand the basis on which we have the government has the fundamental right to interfere with the rights of owners to use their land as they will. And you'd have thought in this respect, the two systems are very different, and it's actually quite interesting for why they are, because the French obviously had a revolution, and the revolution swept away the feudal system of land ownership. So a feudal system essentially is based upon the idea that the king or the queen, the monarchy, owns all the land. And that land is then passed down from the monarch to the gentry, to the landed gentry, and they in turn pass it down to the minor gentry, and they pass it down in turn to the tenant farmers, and they in turn pass it down to the peasants. So everyone is owning land on leasehold essentially, and the freehold is either retained by the crown or by the gentry. So that's essentially what a feudal system is. And of course, in France, that all disappeared during the Revolution. And they introduced a thing called the power of dominion, which essentially said that the owner of land in France, so the leaseholders in France became the enfranchised owner of land in France after the Revolution, and they have the power of dominion over that land. In other words, they have the right to do what they will with that land. And it's only trumped by the power of Imperium. Now, the power of Imperium says that you have the right to do what you will with your land unless the government wishes to do something else with it, in which case your rights don't exist. And so if the French government wishes to build a boulevard through Paris, then they have the right to buy your land with compensation, I'm sure, but nevertheless, you don't have the right to say no. And you don't have the right to appeal. Whereas in Britain, of course, that's completely different. We have a feudal system, ostensibly still. We never abolished the feudal system. But because our system is based upon a leasehold system, and because the civil war that we had, of course, in the 1600s, where Parliament essentially defeated the king in the English Civil War, and the Parliament, of course, was made up of landowners. So Parliament back in the time of the English Civil War, it wasn't a democratic representation of the entire country. It was a very limited representation of the landowning classes, and of course they made sure that their powers were stronger. So in Britain, because we have a feudal system essentially still, we have great respect for the leasehold the leasehold rights that people have, and we have great respect for people's land ownership rights. So ironically, France, which had the revolution and got rid of a feudal system, has weaker protections of people's land ownership rights than we do in the UK. And this has very real life consequences. So for example, the average price of a kilometre of high-speed rail in France is £24 million equivalent. In Britain, and this is an old figure, it's probably gone up way above this now, but the comparable figure at the time was £64 million a kilometre in England. And this is a direct result of these land ownership powers. You know, we whenever we're doing any big infrastructure projects, we have endless delays. We have years and years of appeals and public inquiries and democratic process. And I'm not saying any of that thing is a bad thing, but this doesn't exist in France. If the government wishes to build high-speed rail or a motorway or a major piece of infrastructure, they simply have the right to do it. And so the French system is founded very differently to the British system, and that has profound implications. So a good example of that, this is obviously London, and John Nash and the plan for Regent Street that happened in the 1920s. And this is again a little case study from the book. The plan there shows the area between the Mall and what is now Regent Park. Prior to John Nash's master plan, Portland Place is here, and then the plan afterwards shows the Nash master plan for that. So Portland Place down through Regent Street, Piccadilly Circus, and then through to what was then the Prince Regent's house just off the Mall. And this is an incredibly British plan. It winds its way through the city. It kinks and curves around the bits of land which they weren't able to get hold of, which are generally the rich people around the squares where you couldn't buy the land. So, and that's part of its beauty. Actually, there's something really British and nice about this type of serendipity. In France, of course, you'd have built a boulevard from Regent's Park right the way through. It would be straight as a die, and it would just run through anything in its way. And that, I think, has created a very deep aesthetic difference between urban form in Britain and that in France, which I think is to be celebrated. And of course, the unavoidable kink at the end of Portland Street into Regent Street actually becomes the most beautiful bit of Regent Street, because the church holds the end and the BBC behind it actually then responds to that. So it's actually a beautiful composition, which is purely a pragmatic solution. So let me move on to the system. What happened in Paris? Now, this is Napoleon's nephew, who was Louis Napoleon. Now, what really interested me was that he was exiled from France in the first half of the 19th century, and he was exiled to Regent Street. And so actually he was living in London in exile, watching Regent Street being built. And he was fascinated by Regent Street, and he was fascinated by the beauty of the street when it was finished. And when he went back to Paris in 1848 and became president, he was very keen that they learned from the experience of what happened in Regent Street in Paris. And what he wanted to do was finish Rue de Rivoli. Now, those of you who know Paris will know that this is Rue de Rivoli here, alongside the Tuileries. And in Louis Napoleon's day, it didn't go any further. It ploughed into the medieval heart of Paris at this point by the Louvre. And his father, Bonaparte, had been trying 50 years earlier to finish off Rue de Rivoli and had been frustrated. And Louis Napoleon said, right, as part of my major objective of my term in office is to build Rue de Rivoli. And he failed completely. So 4 years later, his term as president came to an end, and he just hadn't made any progress at all with Rue de Rivoli. And he was massively frustrated by this. He pushed an act through Parliament to allow him a second term in office in order to finish his plans for Paris. And the legislature narrowly voted against him doing this. And so he staged a coup, as you do, and he became Napoleon III. He made himself emperor with a indefinite term and absolute powers. And one of these slightly frustrating things, embarrassing things really about being a master planner is the time and time again in the history of master planning, dictatorial powers become part of what you need to actually implement a master plan, which of course we don't always have access to in the UK. So 1852, he became emperor, and he made his great project, the project, so there's a quote from him there, to modernize Paris. And this included the sewage system and the water supply system, and he commissioned transatlantic ships to compete with Britain on the seas, and a whole range of sort of improvements to the country and Paris in particular. And this is actually him talking to Haussmann. Haussmann's the guy with the sideburns here. Because what he did, he realized that his prefect that he had to do Rue de Rivoli had essentially failed. And so he sacked him. I can't remember the guy's name, unfortunately. He was sacked anyway. And Napoleon headhunted a young, relatively young, I say urbanist. I think it's difficult in France. You wouldn't call them planners or architects, but they probably called urbanists, engineering background. Called Baron Haussmann, who'd been busy working in Bordeaux, and he was headhunted, and he came to Paris and was summoned to Napoleon's office. And on the wall behind Napoleon's desk was this huge plan of Paris, and Napoleon had made this his focus, that he wanted Paris replanned, and he wanted the starting point to be the completion of Rue de Rivoli. So this is Haussmann. He was given unlimited powers to appropriate land, and he was given 50 million francs, which was probably quite a lot of money in those days. And the first job was Rue de Rivoli, and he was told, this is about 1853, that Rue de Rivoli had to be finished within 2 years. He had to cut Rue de Rivoli through that medieval heart of Paris and open it in time for the Great Universal Exhibition in 1855. And he achieved this. Goodness knows how, but this was done. I think there are probably quite a few sensibilities ridden roughshod over to achieve that. But Rue de Rivoli was open, and of course it's one of the great streets of Paris now. And having done that, Napoleon was so impressed that he was able to do this that he asked him to go the step further. This is a cartoon of Haussmann from the time. So there were 3 phases to what he did, and the first phase was called the Cross, La Croisée, and it essentially was this. So the east-west route is Rue de Rivoli through to Bastille, and the north-south route is Sebastopol, down from the stations that were just arriving at the north here, right the way through Boulevard Saint-Michel. And so this cross was the heart of Paris, and that was finished by the end of the 1850s at the cost of 200 million francs. And so actually he managed to get, for every franc he managed to invest, he managed to get 3 francs of private investments through a system essentially of knocking down, appropriating the land, knocking down a great strip of land along each of these boulevards, and then writing a set of codes for the rebuilding of those boulevards, and then selling the land with the benefit of those codes to developers who then built the buildings up, because a boulevard is nothing without its containing buildings. Phase 2 then happened in finished at took about 10 years following that, and was about 16 kilometers of boulevard. And then phase 3 was supposed to start in 1870, and was going to be just as ambitious. But by this time, the people of Paris were pretty fed up with the disruption. I think the next slide, you've got a picture of what Paris was like during that period. Huge disruption, constant dust, constant demolition, and it just seemed to be going on interminably. There's a quote there by Victor Hugo from the time about how Paris was essentially being gutted, and the people lost patience essentially. Louis Napoleon was a little bit more confident with his power, and so he allowed more democratic control, and Haussmann basically got sacked. And then within a few years, Napoleon was overthrown as well. So the process didn't go into a hole. It carried on, and actually Boulevard Haussmann was not finished until 1920. So this is actually, I've just photographed this off one of the books on my shelf. These are all the black lines are the things that Haussmann built or planned in Paris. Of course, it included Bois de Boulogne, the great park, which Napoleon saw as the equivalent to Regent Park, and a whole range of links through Paris, which linked it all together. And we end up with this is the figure ground plan from our book, of Paris today, and it's an incredible combination, as I said before, of boulevards which are very formal and generally straight and quite formal in their character, and then you step into a side street and you're into medieval Paris still. The two exist side by side in a way which I don't think really happens in any other city, and of course, it's a lovely place. The next slide actually just shows what Le Corbusier had in mind for Paris when he was doing his work in the 1920s. So here's the Kabusian plan for Paris, which we tracked down and superimposed over the plan, because you can see there's various things, like he keeps the Louvre and he keeps the Palais Royal and he keeps the stations, obviously, so you can actually work out how the Kabusian idea was to fit into Paris. And unfortunately, they didn't give Kabusier the same sort of powers that Haussmann had, and so it didn't happen. So that's a little bit of sort of history, thinking about things historically. I'm going to turn now in the second part of what I'm going to talk about to the way that the system works now in Paris, in France, not in Paris. I'm going to start with this, which is as I said at the beginning, my wife's French. And her family comes from Dordogne area, and in particular her cousins live in this house here in Bordeaux, suburb of Bordeaux called Mérignac, and we've been going here for the last 20 so years every summer. And it occurred to me that they have two plots. So there's this plot here, and they have a second plot here, which is just a very large garden. I was told actually, and this was not something I realized, that by a French urban designer we have in the office, that these are called flag plots, in that they're plots within the heart of a block, which they're called flag plots because the road is the what's it called, the post of the flag, and then the plot itself is the flag. So these are all called flag plots, and they sit within the middle of the block. And so I thought, well, you know, what we could do, of course, is we could take this second plot and we could build a house on it. And I was told in no uncertain terms that no, this isn't possible, because there is a plot ratio on the whole of this, and the limit of that plot ratio has been reached. And I said, well, obviously, but there's a plot empty. We could surely make the case. And so now there's no making the case in French planning. The rule is the rule, and the rule is non-discretionary, and the planners don't have the ability to change the rule. And so once the coefficient, floor area coefficient of the area has been used up, then that's all the development that can take place. And planners in France are actually not even professionals. I mean, it's not a profession, planning in France. They are bureaucrats. They administer a relatively bureaucratic system. And if you want to build something, you take your plans to them and they check them against the rules for each plot. And if you meet the rules, you are guaranteed to get consent. And if you don't meet the rules, you're guaranteed to get a refusal. There isn't very much in the way of discretion going on. But the benefit of this actually is that 60% of planning decisions in France take place over the counter, in that you can go in and get your plans checked and stamped there and then, as opposed to waiting for 8 weeks, as it would be in the UK. So there are advantages and disadvantages of this non-discretionary system. That was the plot that I was wanting to get hold of, but couldn't. So this is the French system is a zonal system, and this is actually the zone plan for Bordeaux, covering that area. And you can see that the various colours of this plan, and it's worth just looking at the key for that. Here we go. Hadn't realised I'd done some fancy animation on that. So in French planning systems generally, there are these zones that we've got in the box down here. So you have a zone U, which is zone urbain, and this is the existing urban area. And the assumption is that the stuff can take place within the existing urban area, within the rules of the zone. You then have AU, or areas to be developed, which essentially is a equivalent of an allocation in a local plan in the UK. And the zone then tells you how you can build the rules to guide the development of that urban extension. You then have an agricultural zone, and this is obviously, I mean, France has got a huge amount of agricultural land, and there's a lot of zones which are quite complex, which regulate what farmers can do with their land and what buildings can be built. And so on and so forth. And there's a lot of the land area, and probably the biggest zone is the agricultural zone. And then finally you get a zone N, which is essentially no developments can take place. And so things like national parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty, parks within urban areas where no development is allowed. Now, those of you who have been following the planning reforms in the UK may recognise these zones, because they're actually the same essentially that are in the planning white paper. So the renewal areas in the white paper are zone U, the growth areas are zone AU, and then the balance of the area is the no development area. We haven't looked at the agriculture. And I think some of the discussion on the white paper has suggested that they would therefore only be those zones. But if you look at the left-hand side of the screen, you will see how they become applied in practice. This is the Bordeaux version. So the categories actually don't read across fully. But the top ones here, the UM, are the existing urban areas. So we've got the brown, which is the ancient city centre. And a lot of people say that you can't code for historic urban areas, but they do in France. There's rules written for the historic core. We then have local shopping centres, local neighbourhood centres. We then have a zone for modernist housing, of which obviously there's quite a lot in France, so tower blocks and mix of uses. And then the tissue for maison individuelle, so we've got individual homes. This essentially is suburbia. And then we have a particular zone for green areas. Now, these are all existing urban areas. We then have a few particular zones. So we have regeneration areas in orange. We have heritage interest, and then commercial development areas. And these have a particular set of rules. I think when either higher levels of control in terms of conservation or where more change is going to be happening. A couple of zones for infrastructure, transport and the economy, and then zones at urbanisé, to be urbanized. And these are then the zones which relate to areas to develop. And you can see there's one for new multifunctional urban areas, one for urban areas linked to the economy. So I'm assuming that's commercial employment uses, and then proposed long-term development areas, as in stuff which is like safeguarded areas, I think we call them in the UK. And actually then the Bordeaux map is, if you go back to the map, and essentially if you're on the plan, you go onto the computer and you click onto each of these zones and it will take you to the rules. And so it's very precise. So you know exactly what zone your plot is in. You click on that plot there and it will take you into the rules for that. The rules themselves, and having spent the last 4 or 5 months working on what the UK government wants to be a very graphic code, the French codes are very disappointingly ungraphic. They're quite dry legal documents. They have maybe a few diagrams in them, but they're certainly not the sort of design codes that we'd recognize in the UK. They don't have a lot of drawings or stuff in them. There's a lot of legalistic wording in them. The responsibility of these well, so it's, first of all, they used to be called plan d'occupation de sol, which is the term you may have come across. They have been renamed not so long ago, plan local d'urbanisme, PLUs, and that plan you saw of Bordeaux was essentially the PLU for Bordeaux, and they are the responsibility of the communes. Now I think there's something like, is it 5,000 or 7,000 communes in France? There are lots of them. France has an entirely reformed local government system. And so you've got communes like Bordeaux, which are huge cities and equivalent of a city in the UK in terms of its resources. Then you get communes which have less than 1,000 people living in them and have the mayor and maybe a secretary as being the only full-time officials. And so they are the body that's responsible for these plans. And so you get a huge variation. You get very sophisticated plans in somewhere like Bordeaux, but you get to a small rural commune and you may not have a plan at all, quite possibly, but the ones that you'll have will be very limited in scope. And the sort of things these zones have, these plans have within them. So each of the zones has a height, has rules on what the uses can be, heights of buildings, maximum heights, predominant heights, and so on. Arrangement, by which it means where the building is allowed to stand on the plot, setback from the building line, setback from the boundaries, and so on. Sometimes architecture, but certainly not always. Many codes are completely silent on architecture. Services, which is a big thing through these, so utility connections and so on, and what's allowed to connect to the site are actually take up sometimes half of the entire code. And then they have these two density measures, so coefficient d'occupation des sols, which is essentially a floor area ratio, and a surface hausse de oeuvre, which essentially is a plot ratio. So the first one tells you if you take the site area, so for example, a 0.25 floor area ratio, we mean an 800 meter plot could have a 200 meter square building on it, total floor area, whereas the plot ratio will tell you how much of the site that you can cover with building. And then if the code doesn't exist, which, as I say, in some of the smaller communes is the case, the French government have a thing called a Règlement National d'Urbanisme, which is the national default settings for the code, and these take precedence if there aren't any local codes in place. And these cover what you'd expect. So noise and nuisance, you can't do anything on your plot which is going to really annoy your neighbors. It talks about views and aesthetic in the most general terms. And then it has some incredibly clunky rules about height. And so the height of the building can be no greater than the distance from the building to the front of the site. And so you end up with buildings set back both from the frontage, the street frontage, and also from the boundaries. And what you essentially get is a suburban villa in the middle of the site if you follow these rules. And it's actually quite interesting. There was a book published last year by Alain Botreau, a French-born but American economist, called what was it called? It was about the growth of cities and planning, and he recounted an experience of being a young planner in Algiers, having to apply these rules to Algerian cities and trying to get what would have been dense fabric of an Algerian city into something which resembled more like a French villa. And of course, it didn't work at all. And he uses that as a case study of how codes can be misused, which I think is fair enough. If codes have the wrong rules in them, they can be incredibly damaging. In terms of the consents that you need or are available to you in France, essentially the permis de construction is essentially a combined planning permission and building regulations. You get a single permit that allows you to construct, and one of the discussions that have been happening in the UK is whether the planning system and the building reg system might be combined, and whether that's a good idea. But before that, so if you're buying a site, you might apply for a certificate d'urbanisme, and there are two types of this. The first one is something that you get maybe before you buy the site, which will just tell you what you can use the site for. It says you can put a single family home on this site, and it can be as maximum of 200 square meters, and it can't be more than two stories high. And so it'll give you a basic information about what the site is to be used for. The certificate d'urbanisme opérationnel is much more like an outline planning consent in the UK. So it basically based sometimes on a scheme or on a plot passport, and it will give you a detailed rundown of what the code will allow you to build on that site. And then you also, in many areas, get a cahier de charge. And this, for me, is fascinating because basically this applies in areas which have been master planned. So an area, a new housing development, which is master planned, the master plan then has within it a set of rules which apply to each plot. And so each of the homes in the master plan follows what we call a plot passport, perhaps. And then once the development is finished, those rules are then embedded in the leasehold for the land, or embedded legally anyway in the land, and they carry on. So 50 years later, the plot passport rules that were written for the master plan still apply. And so many times in France, you can get a permit de construction from the local commune to build, but actually, if you can't get the cahier de charge from the area in which you're building, you still can't build. The permit de construction doesn't trump the master planning rules, and actually then that gives you a long-term involvement as a master planner over how a place develops, which of course we'd love to have as master planners in the UK. And the thing at the bottom just says that this is all law in France, and so if you build something without planning permission, you can be fined up to 300,000 euros, and you can go to prison for up to 2 years. I'm not sure how often that happens, but the point is that to build this stuff is illegal and arrestable, which again is very different to the UK. And you can have a charge of up to 500 euros a day for unauthorized development. And so this is why it is treated so seriously. People don't mess with the system. And of course, it lies behind this type of development. This is just grabbed from Google Earth earlier as a fairly bog standard bit of central Bordeaux, well-proportioned buildings, all of which follow the rules. It can also relate to this, and this is actually the road at the front of that house that I showed where my wife's family live, which, you know, is dull. It follows a set of rules, and most of France is this. And what this is what most of the French planning system produces. If we're honest, it produces this type of suburbia. But also, and this is just to end. A few years ago, when we were in Bordeaux, there's a fantastic architectural museum in Bordeaux, which is part of the main art gallery called Arc en Rêve, which is architecture of dreams. And we were in there. We always try and go when we're in Bordeaux. But one time I was in there, I bought this book by Rem Koolhaas, which is a book, Rem Koolhaas type book on cities. And within it, there's this fantastic photo essay. And you look at it, and first you look at it and you think, it's American. And then you sort of think, oh, well, actually, the words are French on this. And these extraordinary environments which are photographed in this book. And I was looking through it when I got back to the house after going to the exhibition, and Cecile, Elaine's cousin, said, oh, that's just around the corner. This is where we go shopping. And actually these pictures are Bordeaux. And they're actually only 15 minutes or so drive from the suburb that we're just looking at. And the point being that in France, when you fall off the end of the zone, there is no control at all. And actually you notice this when you drive around France. If you drive around France, certainly on the national roads rather than the motorways, what you'll find is you'll go into towns and you'll see what's around the periphery. And it is worse than anything in the UK. And it's incredibly American in its look, and it's dreadful, essentially. And this is what happens when you get beyond the zone, when all of a sudden there isn't any controls, and all this stuff can happen. So I think it's interesting that it's different, and I think it has a lot going for it as a system, but it isn't necessarily always going to produce good results. And that is my conclusion. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Where do we start? We took a driving trip out of Lyon one year to look at some Le Corbusier monuments, and came back and had a very memorable meal in a roadside food mall in one of these huge retail parks. And it was either this or the multi-story Chinese restaurant. And then we got back into historic Lyon. So there's all matter of kind of like falling off the edge of the zone is a really interesting kind of concept.
Yeah.
For
many years, of course, I was only traveling around France by train, so I never saw any of this stuff. You arrive in the centre and you think it's all beautiful, it's amazing. And when you drive around, you suddenly realise it's not at all. Yes,
yes. You artfully dodged the any mention of the National Design Code, so we're not going to talk about that until the absolute release. But perhaps, I mean, but you are talking about kind of design codes, and I just, as a general question to kind of start things off, is this question of discretion, and whether we in the UK are too used to a system of discretion. Things are we're too used to drawing out the exceptions in places and schemes, and I guess linked to this is also a kind of a question about front loading the development process in a way that might exclude. We're used to assessing schemes as members of the public when the scheme is coming through, and because of the discretionary element, we can judge it on its merits. Whereas if the rules have been established right at the start, that conversation has already passed. So perhaps you can talk about a little bit of that.
And this is a really important point. The trite answer, in a sense, is the drawing up of the code is an intensely democratic exercise. It's done by elected representatives. It involves consultation, and that it establishes the principles through consultation. Of course, the weakness of that answer is that the people who will get involved at that early, fairly abstract stage are going to be the committee minority, and most people are just going to think it doesn't apply to them until you want to build next to their house, in which case it'll become much more relevant. The more nuanced answer, and I think, I mean, I don't know whether Catherine talked about this last week in terms of Boston, because when we were talking to Catherine about Boston, it was quite interesting that the code will give you the right to develop. So I've got a plot and the code tells me that I'm able to build a 3-story building of whatever square meters on this height, and the front it's got to be here and so on. And so, but that doesn't mean you don't consult on the way it's designed. And so the point is, it's a tiered consultation process. You consult on the principles, and then you consult on the detail, and then you consult on the implementation. And at each stage, the consultation relates to that level of development. In the UK, of course, we consult on the local plan, and then once that's agreed, the proposals come forward, and people still object to the principle, even though the plan has been agreed. And at each stage, we consult on everything, as opposed to this sort of tiered process of detail. And so it isn't without its problems, and it is one of the potential weaknesses. But actually, I remember talking to a Dutch planner and we were talking about at the time we were having a problem at Urbed with a master plan going through huge opposition, and the Dutch planner goes, "Well, it's been approved in the plan, isn't it?" We go, "Well, yeah, it's in the plan, it's allocated." "Well, why are you consulting then?" was the answer. The principle's been agreed. Consult on the design, but don't consult on the principle because it's already been agreed.
Yeah. Something of a culture shift. If you were designing a system, it makes complete sense. It's that we just have the legacy of having got used to doing things a certain kind of way. There are a few questions coming in, and Roland Carthouse has asked a couple about land, actually. And there's a question he asked at the start of the talk, and one probably a follow-up. But one, he says, is the value of land in France also affected by the more limited rights of ownership? That is, does the land value price in the risk that it might be usurped by the government?
I knew you were going to ask this, and actually, I'm not an expert on land value capture in France in particular. I mean, when we did the Wilson thing, we found it really difficult to find authoritative information on what happens elsewhere, and the best stuff was available from Germany. And in Germany, basically, there is a law which says that when land is allocated in a zoning plan or through consent, there is a cap on the increase in land value, which is about tenfold. And so therefore, agricultural land at 20,000 a hectare will go up to 200,000 a hectare, perhaps, whereas in the UK, this same piece of land will go up to 2 million. So there's an order of magnitude difference in the UK, and it's partly down to our discretionary system. It's partly down to the fact that we never managed to stick with a land value capture betterment tax in the UK, which was part of our system when it was built, and partly because I think that the discretion makes the speculation all the greater. So all the land around our towns and cities is all optioned by planning agents on the long bet that they might get planning permission and make a huge amount of money out of it. So you end up with speculation built into our system. And European systems don't have that same speculation. And so land value in Germany in particular never went up. So, land value, there was an amazing graph in The Economist which said the land value per hectare in Germany is broadly the same as it was in the 1970s, albeit with inflation. I mean, it hasn't increased beyond inflation. France, I suspect, is not dissimilar, but I don't know the details of France because I've never found a source. If you know of a source of French land value capture, then I'd be very well pleased to know.
No. Does that make a better city? Does that make better cities in Germany and France? The fact that the values haven't gone and there hasn't been rampant speculation.
Well, the simple answer is that the money that goes into the land in the UK goes into other stuff. Like trams, for example. The process of building infrastructure in cities is so much more advanced in European countries than they are in the UK, because all our money seems to go into the land. And actually, even then, it doesn't always find its way to the owner. It tends to find its way into the pockets of all the consultants who are there to try and unlock our system. So yeah, the French have the build tram. The Bordeaux has a fantastic tram system, which then goes out into these suburbs that are being built.
Yeah, yeah. Claire St. Martin asks a really good question. How often are PLUs revised, which I guess some of the master plan kind of coding laws?
Hi, Claire. Yeah, again, this runs into the difficulty of me not being, as I admitted to you at the beginning, I think from looking at the Bordeaux one, I think it would be revised on a fairly regular basis. I mean, similar to what we aspire to, but fail, like a 5-year basis. We're supposed to do that with UK plans, which of course very rarely do. I suspect that some of the ones in sleepy suburbs or sleepy villages hardly ever get updated and probably don't even get finished in the first place. And so it's such a localized system that it's quite hard to generalize. And I don't think there is a law in France which says you have to redo it every 5 years, but the big cities will certainly do that. And the big cities are very sophisticated, the plans.
Yeah, yeah. And it seems Claire also asked how a required number of new homes for each town or region determined. And I guess part of the planning reforms at the moment in the UK are driven by a push to kind of ease the crisis and up house building numbers.
Yeah, again, that stuff.
Is the French system responsive?
Yeah, again, that stuff that we've tended to find more stuff on in Holland and Germany than in France. And of course, in Holland, they've had a drive over the last 30, 40 years to build significant numbers of homes, certainly comparable to the size of the country, more significant than in the UK. And that has gone into a whole process of planned extensions and the VINEX process and so on. Again, I'm sorry not to be the expert on all the stuff French, because I'm not sure what's happened there, but certainly in other places have planned much more effectively for housing growth than we have. I mean, the point about it is that they decide which areas are to be built, whereas in the UK, we have a call for sites, and then people put all their sites in, and then they try and sort of criticize all the other sites that have been put in, and then the least harmful is the one that gets allocated, whereas what we should be doing is planning the one that can be developed most sustainably, regardless of who owns it.
Yeah, yeah. I recall the land betterment tax vaguely through the post-war era. Sort of went through these cycles of being introduced, and I think there was a time in UK where there was 100% betterment tax that was introduced by the Labour. And as soon as the Tories got in, 3 years later, they repealed the tax, and then it got reinstated again. And I think it did the cycle a few times before we're in a current kind of from the 80s neoliberal kind of era, and we've just sort of given up on it, or at least kind of got these crazy kind of, and let's say sophisticated mechanisms of trying to get some land value capture.
And what we have is Section 106 and SIL.
Yeah.
Which is the problem about those things is that they're regressive. You know, the poorer the community and the more need of maybe spending, the less there is to be collected. So, which is the problem with those things. And you know, we need to. And my colleague Nicholas Falk will tell us we need to deal with the issue of land value capture in the UK. Massive glaring hole in our system.
Yeah, yeah. Laura Ringsell asks, what parts of the French system would you bring into the British to get much needed infrastructure projects off the ground? We seem to lag on this, as I think we were just talking about, on this compared to some of our neighbours.
Well, I think, you know, in the book, we argue for a less discretionary system in Britain based around rules and zoning, essentially, so that I think there's a logical process. And I take the point, Daryl, exactly, that if you inventing a system, it would be a logical way of doing it, but moving from where we are now to where is the hard bit. Yeah. But actually a non-discretionary system, which actually in terms of things like infrastructure, you could see the Bordeaux plan had the infrastructure zones built within it, and therefore the principle of development in those zones is then accepted when the plan is approved and is no longer up for discussion. And I think, you know, our democracy is great, and our process of consulting people is a very British way of doing things, but it does mean, first of all, that things cost a huge amount more. In the UK, I've quoted the figures for high-speed rail, but also that they take an awful long time to build. And I think a way of making clear decisions about what we want to do as a society and then get on and do them is what planning should be doing. And I think the British planning system actually thwarts that, which is what needs to change, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I was quite interested when you said zoning for historic areas, because I was probably one of those naysayers who were thinking, actually, if you cut up, you know, if you divide all land into 3 categories, that's a pretty coarse way of doing things. So I was encouraged by kind of the subcategories and actually dealing with some very complicated kind of areas. Presumably, well, you can't talk about the guide, but I mean, I think in the French system, presumably that's quite an effective way of doing things, because there are some wonderful things happening in historic areas in terms of, you know, new developments and restored monuments.
They speak by their results, don't they? I mean, it's often said, you can't code for conservation areas, you can't code for historic centres. And you say the great historic cities of Europe are all coded, and Rome is coded. And as you say, the results speak for themselves. They're not undermined or ruined by the coding process. Because buildings follow building lines and the buildings fit within the envelope of height and so on. And my view as a planner has always been that if you follow the building line and you stick within the height, and you face the right way and you have an active frontage if you need to, then actually you can build whatever you want, because you won't do any harm. You go around cities, I mean, Berlin is a really good example. You know, Berlin functions fantastically as a city, but the architecture is on the whole quite dull. And often quite brutalist, but actually because it all follows the basic rules, the streets, and this beautiful city. Whereas, you know, we in Britain we focus on, you know, the bricks that are used and the quality of the architecture, and if we forget the basics, it seems we've got everything the wrong way around. That we shouldn't be controlling the architecture as planners, because honestly, as planners, we're not trained to. You know, I'm a planner by training, and you know, we get very limited training in architecture, and yet you know, you've got like a 20-something planner sort of telling a very experienced architect how to design their buildings, which is... I can hear all the architects on this in this session just going, hooray. Yeah. It doesn't seem to make, particularly when you then miss issues of building line or the building space in the wrong way, or all the basic things which planners should be dealing with don't seem to feature. But then you focus in on the detail too much.
Are there design review panels in France or in Germany?
I know there are. I know Catherine talked about them in Boston. I don't know is the answer. I think design review panels are a force for good. I know that there's been criticism. The legacy of CAVE is now seen as not necessarily positive, but my experience of them, of having peers discussing in an intelligent and open way the buildings that are being proposed, is a very effective way of thinking about those aesthetic non-coding issues. And so essentially the code tells you size, form, basics, and then your peers have a conversation with you about how it's been designed. And I think that's a much more civilized way of dealing with that, rather than trying to control everything. Yeah. Oh, well, that comes in. I'm sure that comes as, you know, a welcome comment to many designers on this call. And perhaps one last one from Carlos Soto, although I think you've kind of covered this. Do you think codes and regulations go in contrast with the spirit of versatility and evolutions of today's urban design and architecture, or these codes and approaches can actually support the endeavor of designers to make better places? Well, that's a good question, because that's the fundamental message of the book, that basically loose fit codes provide a frame into which individuality can take place, can run riot. And so basically you code for the envelope of the building, and then you don't code for the details. So, you know, somewhere like Manhattan, and you can discuss Manhattan and what it's like, but Manhattan is coded. The Manhattan Code apparently runs to 3,000 pages. And but you know, Manhattan is not being constrained by being coded, because huge self-organization and variety happens within a loose fit parameters of the code, and that's my view of codes.
Yeah.
And it's something it's different for a site that's coded. So you get sites that are coded in a very detailed way, as in almost down to giving you building types that can be used in each street. And I think they are susceptible to that criticism, that they're stifling creativity, but actually codes generally, I think, can be a force for good in that respect. Yeah,
yeah. Very good. Well, actually, I've got to do this last one because it makes reference to your Wolfson Prize. Is there any appetite for large-scale standalone development in French areas of housing demand, for example, around Bordeaux, for a French Uxester garden city, if you will, from an anonymous attendee?
Well, there are. I mean, I have to say that the French track record of building urban extensions is not brilliant. I think they're probably slightly better than in the UK. And as I say, the master planning process and the way that the rules carry on, the areas that work tend to work in that respect. But I've been through some dreadful ones as well. I mean, I've been through some down around Paris, Val de Marne, which is the big urban extension in Paris, and it's not something to write home about. And so, yeah, I think I was trying to be nuanced. I was not saying the French system is brilliant and always produces good results, because it clearly doesn't. Yeah. But I think there's stuff we can learn from it nevertheless.
Yes. I mean, it's been fascinating and really informative, and hopefully it kind of prompts some people to get into your book, so that, because there are so many wonderful and accessible, informative stories in that. I particularly like the way that you sort of almost made the Haussmann-like extension of Paris an outgrowth of Regent Street. It was all because of us, really.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is how, even though you're speaking for the French system, you're a Brit at heart. So this has been wonderfully stimulating, and thank you for joining us for the call, for the chat and the talk. And yeah, long may kind of discussions kind of continue about how British planning system can improve. And we wait with bated breath with the release of the National Design Code, which do you have? Can you say about when that might be coming out?
It will be within a month and a half, maybe. It's relatively close, but we yeah, maybe this year, but certainly early next year, if not this year.
Great. We don't have anything better to be thinking about, really.
Right.
A good design code. Excellent. All right.
It's a pity we can all go down the pub and then carry on the conversation, but unfortunately not at the moment.
Yeah, well, we're all looking forward to doing that. So on behalf of everybody who's joined the call, and there are some familiar faces on there, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining the London Society. Have a good evening, and we'll see you at the next event. Cheerio.